There are mornings when the city feels like it's breathing against your skin, heavy, loud, alive. I used to love that sound. The buses screeching, the vendors yelling, the church bells echoing from the hills. It was the rhythm of Mexico City, chaotic but alive. Now, it feels like a reminder of everything I haven't become. My name is Diego Morales, and I am, or maybe I was an actor. At least, that's what I still tell myself when I wake up every morning in this tiny room we call home. The walls are cracked, the ceiling leaks when it rains, and the paint has long faded into something that looks like sadness. My mother, Doña Rosa, sleeps in the corner, wrapped in her old blanket that smells of eucalyptus and prayer. My daughter, Isabella, sleeps beside her, small, beautiful, unaware of how cruel the world can be. And then there's Lucia, my wife. Once upon a time, she was the fire in my blood, the woman who believed in my art, in my dreams. Now, she's mostly quiet, the kind of silence that hurts more than words ever could. Every morning, I look at them and whisper to myself, Diego, today will be different. Today they will see you. Then I put on the same faded jeans, grab my folder of scripts, and walk out into the city chasing auditions, chasing hope. The theater world in Mexico City is a jungle. There are hundreds of us dreamers with cracked voices and empty pockets, all fighting for the same few roles. Some are lucky, others are just connected. Me, I'm neither. But I can act. When I'm on stage, I feel alive. I feel like God is breathing through me. It's the only time the noise in my head goes quiet. Yet talent doesn't pay rent. I still remember one morning at an audition in Colonia, Roma. I had spent my last peso on the bus fare to get there. I was starving, but I told myself I'd use that hunger as energy to make my performance more real. The casting director didn't even look up. She was scrolling through her phone, her coffee steaming on the table. I gave it my all, poured my heart out. When I finished, she simply said, "Gracias. Next." That was it. No feedback, no emotion, no recognition of the fire that was dying inside me. I walked back home that day through the crowded streets, past the taco stands, past the people laughing, holding hands, living lives that seemed unreachable. My shoes were torn, my pride even more so. When I reached home, Lucia was waiting. Her face said everything before her lips moved. "Did you get it?" she asked softly. "No, not this one," I replied. "Not this one," she repeated. "It's never this one, Diego." Her voice trembled not in anger but in exhaustion. She walked away, muttering something about the rent. I didn't follow her. I just sat by the window, looking out at the slanted rooftops, wondering how long I could keep believing in something no one else believed in anymore. Then from behind me, a small voice said, "Papa, will you be on TV one day?" I turned. Isabella was smiling at me with her missing front tooth, holding her little doll. Her eyes were full of the kind of faith adults forget how to have. I smiled back, even though my throat tightened. "She, me, Amor," I whispered. "One day, Papa will be on every screen in Mexico." And in that moment, for the first time that day, I believed it again. The days blurred into each other like smudged charcoal. Auditions, rehearse, walk, eat, sleep. The cycle of the hungry artist. Some weeks we ate rice for dinner. Other weeks, nothing but an empanada wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Still, I would wake and dress and try to be somebody different in front of other people, because pretending was sometimes the only affordable escape. I started taking small jobs to survive. I pushed a cart at the Mercado on Saturdays, sweeping up after a children's puppet show at a barrio festival, and once I even played a statue in the plaza near the Catedral Metropolitana for tips. People tossed coins and laughed and took pictures with me, and for a moment I felt the applause of strangers burn like sunshine on my face. That warmth was brief, but it kept me breathing. There were nights when the weight of it all made me dizzy. One night I stood on the bridge over Rio de la Piedad and watched the city lights ripple over the water. I thought about giving up. I imagined a life where I worked in a tienda, where my hands learnt bar codes rather than stage directions. It seemed safer. Lucia's face floated in that quiet water, tired, hollowed by too many broken promises. I touched the rusted rail and whispered, "Maybe it's time." But even then, the actor in me hated cowardice. The idea of trading my name for convenience felt like selling my soul for a plate. So I turned my back on the river and kept walking. I went home and sat on the floor, and in the dark, I rehearsed Hamlet's proposal to the moon until my voice shook. Sometimes the smallest things held weight. A neighbor, Senora Perez, who sold tamales, would slide a warm Tamil through the door with a wink when she saw my empty cupboard. The kids in the alley would clap when I made funny faces, and their laughter became the rehearsed sound of an audience. And then there was the day that changed something, though not enough to lift the roof off our tiny room, not immediately. It was an audition in a cramped studio near Coyoacan. The role was small, a supporting part in a local theater production, but I wanted it like a drowning man wants air. I arrived late, more by luck than planning, my script folder pressed to my chest like a shield. The room smelled of stale coffee and paint. The casting director, a woman with stiff hair and tired eyes, looked at my resume without enthusiasm. Around me were other actors, all polished, all with cleaner shoes and better shoestrings. When my name was called, my stomach did a small somersault. I stepped into the square of light and imagined the sea of faces. I prepared the monologue I had rehearsed in front of a cracked mirror for weeks. It was a piece by Lorca, heavy with longing and small joys, and when I began, something happened inside me like an old door opening. I forgot the casting director, the dusty studio, the other actors, and even my empty pockets. I was a man who had loved and lost and still loved, who wanted a better sunrise for his daughter. My voice broke on certain lines, and I let it. Instead of polishing my performance to be tidy, I let the rawness show. I remembered my mother's hands, the smell of her soup, the way she folded my childhood into blessings. When I finished, I expected the usual, gracias, next. But the woman's eyes were wet. For the first time in months, someone looked at me like they saw more than a resume. She said, "Poor favor, wait." She asked me to sit. She asked me questions about my life, about my mother, about Isabella. We talked like two people who had found a secret in the middle of a crowd. I told her about the markets, about playing statues in plazas, about the nights I rehearsed by the light of a faulty bulb. She listened. She didn't judge. That evening she called me back. Not for advice, not for charity, but for the play. She offered me the part. When I left that studio, the world seemed sharper. Colors were more honest. I ran to the plaza and bought 2 tamales, one for me and one to bring home. I walked through the neighborhood with my heart high as a kite. For the first time in months, Lucia smiled at me without faking it. Isabella hugged me as if she had been waiting for the news all day. My mother, still frail but with that steady glow in her eyes, patted my shoulder and said, "Dios es bueno." It wasn't a movie contract, it wasn't big money, but it was a role, a place to belong. And when you've been starving for a while, even a small plate tastes like a feast. That part changed the rhythm of our days for a little while. I rehearsed in the afternoons, delivered lines until my tongue was numb, and learned to trust the silence that comes before applause. The theater people were rough but honest. They taught me to listen to a room. They taught me how to find truth in the smallest gesture. I found myself again in those rehearsals, a man with a voice and a story. Yet life demanded payment in other ways. The rent collector didn't care if my heart was full of monologues. The electricity bill arrived with the same chill as a police summons, and under every small joy was the nagging fear that it could end at any moment. One missed payday was enough to topple the day like a house of cards. But for those nights, in that brief window between rehearsal and sleep, I was an actor who belonged to the stage. I felt alive. And that, the feeling of being alive, is a dangerous thing. It makes you pick up dreams others have discarded. It turns you into someone willing to stand in the rain and recite poetry for a stranger's coin. It gives you faith to say to your daughter, Papa will be on every screen in Mexico, and then believe it with the ferocity of prayer. So I lived for those moments. I fed on them. I stacked them like precious wood to warm ourselves in the cold mornings. Little did I know the next storms were already forming, quiet, distant at first, then growing, until they came crashing down with a force I had never imagined. For a few months, life almost felt normal again. The theater wasn't big, just a small, run-down building tucked behind Avenida Insurgents, with creaky wooden floors and the faint smell of dust and forgotten dreams. But to me, it was paradise. Every time I stepped onto that stage, I felt taller, lighter, infinite. Lucia started smiling again. She would wait for me after rehearsals, her hair wrapped in a scarf, carrying Isabella on her hip. We would walk home through the streets, laughing about the day, dreaming about what we'd do when the play opened. "Maybe this is it," she said once, her eyes shining. "Maybe this is the beginning." "It is," I told her, though I wasn't entirely sure. I didn't care how small the theater was. I was finally working. I was being paid not much, but enough to buy meat once a week, to pay half the rent on time, to let Isabella go to school without shame. For the first time in years, I started believing I was climbing, even if the ladder was made of glass. My mother, Rosa, loved coming to rehearsals. She would sit quietly in the corner, wrapped in her shawl, watching me perform as if I were on the biggest stage in Mexico. Her eyes would follow me with pride that words couldn't hold. "You were born for this, Diego," she'd whisper when we walked home together. "You always say that, Mama." "Because it's true," she'd smile. "Even when you were a boy, you were never afraid to pretend." Those words, "you were born for this," became my fuel. But life, I've learned, is not kind to dreamers. The higher you climb, the easier it is for the wind to knock you down. One rainy evening, just a week before opening night, my mother didn't show up at the theater. I thought maybe she was just tired. But when I got home, I found her lying on the bed, pale and trembling. "Maman," I rushed to her side. Her breathing was shallow, sweat soaked through her shawl. Lucia ran to the kitchen for water. "Mama, what's wrong?" I whispered. She tried to smile. "It's nothing, Mijo, just tired, maybe a little fever." But I could see the fear in her eyes. We called the clinic the next morning. The doctor said it was pneumonia. She needed medication, tests, and possibly a hospital stay. We couldn't afford any of it. That week was the longest of my life. I tried everything, sold my only good jacket, pawned my old guitar, even borrowed from friends who didn't have much more than I did. At night, I'd perform at the theater, trying to keep my emotions locked away until the curtain fell. But every time I delivered a line about loss or love, I thought of her, my mother, fighting for breath in that dim little room. Lucia started to change again. Her warmth turned cold. She spoke less, avoided my eyes. I could feel her slipping like sand through my fingers. "We can't keep living like this," she said one night, her voice sharp. "What do you want me to do, Lucia?" "Get a real job, Diego. Forget these plays, they don't feed anyone." "This is all I know how to do." "Then maybe that's the problem." Her words hit me harder than any rejection. I wanted to yell. I wanted to tell her that art was the only thing keeping me sane. But I just sat there, silent, because deep down I knew she was right. Love doesn't fill empty plates. The play opened 2 days later. I performed like a man possessed. Every line was fire. Every tear was real. The audience clapped, but I couldn't feel any of it. When I got home that night, the light in our room was dim. My mother was asleep. Her breathing sounded worse. I sat beside her and held her hand, the same hand that had carried me through every storm. I whispered lines from the play softly, so as not to wake her. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, she wasn't breathing anymore. It was still dark outside. The rain hadn't stopped. I touched her hand, cold, stiff, lifeless. For a moment I couldn't move. The world went silent. No rain, no city, just a stillness that swallowed everything. Lucia woke up when she heard me crying. She covered her mouth, gasping. Diego, no. I held my mother's hand until sunrise. We buried her 3 days later. I couldn't afford a proper coffin. A neighbor helped me buy one on credit. I carried it myself because that was the least I could do. The priest said she was in a better place. But I didn't believe him, because if heaven was real, why did it take her when I still needed her the most? After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. Isabella asked, "Where's Abuela?" I told her she was with the angels. She nodded, then said, "Will she see your play from there?" That broke me completely. I couldn't answer, I just hugged her. That night, I sat outside under the rain, looking at the flickering lights of the city. I whispered to the sky, "Mama, I'm sorry, I tried, I really tried." And for the first time in my life, I didn't know if my dream was a blessing or a curse. There are moments when life separates itself into a before and an after, as if someone tore the sky in two and let the dark fall through. The week after my mother's funeral felt like that, a pale, slow death of everything that had kept us standing. At first, the small comforts held. The theater people came by with casseroles and awkward condolences. They told me I was brave, that the show must go on, and I believed them because I needed to. The rehearsals became my infirmary. On stage, behind makeup and lights, grief looked like art. It had edges and intention. Off stage, it was raw and cold and ordinary. Lucia tried to hold us together. She rearranged the blankets, swept the corners, held Isabella a little tighter when she laughed. But at night, after we'd given our daughter to sleep and the house shrank to our two shadows, Lucia would sit by the window and stare at the street, not at me. I could feel the distance grow between us like a room being measured. She began talking about money more, not because she was cruel, but because the math of our life had become a fist around her throat. The bills were no longer numbers, they were weather patterns, sudden storms that knocked down anything fragile. Rent, school fees, the debt for the coffin, each one had its own knock at the door. "Diego," she said one evening, voice dry as the bread we couldn't afford, "I need stability. Isabella needs stability. She is learning to read, and she asks why other mothers buy new shoes. She asks me why Abuela is not here to braid her hair. I don't know how to answer." I wanted to tell her that art is a kind of bread, that stories feed more than the stomach. I wanted to tell her that someday, soon, our names would be on posters and lights, that Isabella would be proud and tell her classmates that her father was an actor. But my words were small and thin like tissue paper. They wouldn't stop the cold. She started working small jobs herself, cleaning a hairdresser's salon at night, selling empanadas at the mercado at dawn. I admired her, and I resented her, both in the same breath. There were nights I watched her leave and felt the shape of my failure like a bruise. Then Ricardo came into our lives like a different kind of weather. A sudden, bright sun that warmed everything at once and made us forget how dark the night could be. I first saw him at the corner of Cal Abrera, where a new boutique had opened. He was tall, well-dressed, an expensive cologne cutting through the city smell. The women in the neighborhood called him Señor Vargas like he was a character in a telenovela. Lucia ran into him by accident, carrying a tray of empanadas, sticky with sugar and heat, and he smiled at her in a way that made something fragile in her wake. Ricardo had a laugh like coins and pockets deep as wells. He asked Lucia about her daughter, complimented her beauty, paid for empanadas he hadn't eaten. When a man can buy light, people forget the darkness that sold it to them. He started offering her help. At first it was practical money for a school uniform, a check for a medical test. I told myself not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Who was I to refuse assistance when my family was hungry? But assistance with a smile can be the same as a hand that takes and takes until the giver no longer sees where they have been. One night I came home late from rehearsal to find the door closed and Lucia's voice on the phone in the dim hallway. She thought I was asleep. I heard her laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in months, and my chest went cold with a new kind of fear. I stood in the dark and listened to the way her voice became smaller and brighter at the same time. That was the first time I really understood what hunger becomes when it's not just hunger for food. Hunger can be hunger for comfort, for dignity, for a life that looks like others. Ricardo could buy a roof that had better paint and curtains that didn't sag. He could buy an air that said tomorrow would be softer. Lucia, who had carried grief without complaining, began to fold her shoulders differently around that idea of softness. It didn't happen with yelling or a slam. It happened in small acts, a bouquet left on the table with no note, a check quietly slipped into a handbag, a hand that helped carry Isabella to school when I was too tired to stand. I watched these small transactions of tenderness and felt them like knives. I tried to be reasonable. We had no choice sometimes, but each kindness from Ricardo was another brick in a wall I could not climb. Then one afternoon, Lucia said, without preamble, "Diego, he wants to meet Isabella's teacher. He says he can arrange for a scholarship at Colegio San Miguel." The name alone sounded like a promise we had once whispered to each other and had been told to stop dreaming about. I should have been glad. Instead, I felt a quiet alarm sound in my chest. In the following days, Ricardo grew bolder. He visited the market and asked after Isabella like a proud uncle. He arrived at our door with toys and a box of new clothes. He paid the school fees he said he would. He told me he admired artists, that he respected people who followed their passion. His eyes were always a little too long on Lucia when he said it. I remember the night he invited us to dinner. It was at a restaurant with white tablecloths and soft music that my pockets had only seen when I turned my life into play in my head. Lucia wore a dress for the first time in months, and Isabella balled her fist around a fork like it was treasure. Ricardo spoke of opportunities in low tones. He called his business investments and said things about providing for families. He listened to me with a courtesy that felt like a bank account being opened, not much, but something. After that dinner, our life shifted like tectonic plates. Ricardo's help did not come without strings. He started asking Lucia to come to events with him. He called late at night. He texted her good morning messages and sent her photos of places I had never been. He built a picture of a life that included her in it without me. I confronted Lucia once. "What is this?" I said, standing in the kitchen where the light burned at one bulb. "What does he want?" She looked at me with weary eyes and said, "He says he can keep us safe. He says he can give Issa things we can't." She touched Isabella's hair and added quietly, "He is not bad, Diego. He just has the means we need." Maybe I was foolish to think I could compete with currency. Maybe loving someone is not always enough. But when my wife left, not with a shout or a fight, but with a suitcase and a promise I couldn't afford to match, something inside me turned to ice. She told me she was going to be back by morning. She kissed Isabella lightly on the forehead and left. She took no bedspread, no photos, only a bag of clothes and a look back that was softer than I expected. I stood at the doorway until the light of the street swallowed her silhouette, until her footsteps blended with the city noise and then stopped like a record that had been cut. She didn't return that morning. She didn't return for the week or the month. The apartment kept its shape, but the breath inside it left. Letters came, short messages at first. "We'll be fine, school is sorted. We need to think of Isabella." They were written like someone who needed to soften a blow for a child. I read them with a trembling hand and tried to believe the kindness in them. I loved Isabella. I wanted to be their everything. But the world is crueler than good intentions. Then came news that cut the line between hope and reality. Lucia had chosen to stay with Ricardo. She said he had offered a life she could not refuse, a life with security for Isabella and comfort for herself. The phone calls became less frequent. When she did call, I heard rustle of silk and laughter that was not for me. Isabella's voice on the phone sounded far away. She began to call me Papa with an odd new reverence, as if her love had been furnished by someone else in the meantime. I begged. I begged with the kind of voice that collapses humility into pleading, and she cried and said she was sorry, and she told me not to make her feel guilty. The last time we spoke, she said a simple sentence that I'll carry forever. Diego, I need to secure a future for Issa. You must understand. I wanted to say, we don't need someone to buy our future. We need someone who believes in it with us. But I only heard the click of the line as it went dead. When they left, both of them, though never together in any single frame I saw, my world collapsed in a way that had nothing to do with physical space. It is one thing to lose a role, another to lose your mother, but to watch the woman who stitched the edges of your life walk into another man's arms was a kind of drowning where the water was made of paper and promises. At first, I slept on the floor where Isabella had once laughed. The silence there was so complete my ears hummed. I walked the city in a fog, went to rehearsals with a face that was hollowed by loss, and returned to an apartment that smelled like someone else's perfume. People said time would heal. People say a lot of things to make the living feel less ashamed about surviving. Weeks went by. Ricardo's name appeared sometimes in whispers on the street, not from admiration alone, there were rumors. He was involved in things the newspapers hinted at and the neighbors rolled their eyes at. When you live in the margins, you learn that some kindnesses come wrapped in danger. But to Lucia, those wrapped hands were warmth. To me, they were the end of comfort and the beginning of an ache I carried under my ribs. In the days after they left, I performed because the stage still called me. I clung to the script like a lifeline. But the audience no longer felt like strangers. They looked like us, the ones left behind, and sometimes their pity made me choke. I kept seeing Lucia's face in the crowd, not angry, not hateful, just tired and far, and it was worse than any insult. One night, after a performance that had earned me an honest applause and nothing more, I walked to the bus stop and watched the city lights smear into streams. A group of men laughed nearby. A woman pushed a stroller. Life moved with the casual cruelty of someone who had not been through what I had. I sat down on a bench and felt old before my time. I thought about leaving this city that had swallowed anything I'd tried to plant. I thought about taking a bus far away, to a town with less noise, where grief might not find such easy purchase. But every time I thought of leaving, I thought of Isabella's teeth-marked drawings and her chipped mug with Papa painted in clumsy letters. I thought of my mother's hands. I thought of the stage. And the thought of leaving all of that behind felt like betrayal. So I stayed. I learned how to live inside the echo of their absence. I ate less. I slept less. I rehearsed more. And I watched from the corners of the theater how life could be bought and sold while dreams could not be bartered for a little longer. The lights had gone out in my house, but the stage lights still burned. They were cruel in their own way because they showed me what I could be and what I had lost. Each night I stood under them, I felt the ache, not only for what Lucia had taken with her, but for the bright, foolish, stubborn thing I could not give up. The belief that one day, when the curtains opened, I would be whole again. When a man loses everything, the world does not stop to watch him fall. It simply keeps turning, indifferent, letting his grief trail behind like dust on a forgotten road. That was how life felt after Lucia left, quiet, colorless, and endless. Days became each other. The mornings arrived without reason, the nights stretched too long. I woke up to silence. Not the soft silence of peace, the kind that carries a hum of life, but the hollow kind where echoes have no place to return to. The chair beside the table was still there, her chair. It leaned slightly to one side, its cushion still dented by her weight. I left it that way for months. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped that if I didn't move it, she'd come back. Maybe I just needed to believe that something still remembered her shape. I took on small acting gigs, commercials, background roles, theater plays in rundown halls. Most didn't pay enough for food, but they paid enough for a dream. Sometimes I'd walk back home after a show, clutching my costume bag like it carried hope itself. But dreams do not feed you, and bills do not disappear. There came a month when everything pressed in at once: rent, electricity, Isabella's unpaid school fees, the debt from my mother's burial. I had nothing left. I remember the day Isabella was sent home from school. The teacher, Señorita Ramos, met me at the gate with soft pity in her eyes. "Señor Morales," she said, "I'm so sorry. The school cannot keep her without payment. She's bright, very bright, but rules are rules." Isabella clung to my arm, her face small and wet. She didn't say a word. Children don't always understand poverty, but they understand shame. And that day, I saw it in her eyes, the same shame I'd felt my whole life. We walked home in silence, the sound of her small shoes scraping the dust. When we reached the door, she looked up at me and asked quietly, "Papa, is it because you don't act in the big movies yet?" I smiled, or tried to. "Yes, me Ammer. When Papa gets a big role, everything will change." She nodded as though she believed me. Maybe she did. Children can still believe in broken fathers. That night, as she slept beside me, because the other room was too cold, I watched her chest rise and fall and felt a helpless anger I couldn't name. At life, at myself, at Lucia, at the empty wallet sitting on the table. I prayed, I don't even know to whom. Maybe to my mother, maybe to the same God I hadn't spoken to in years. I whispered, "Just one chance, that's all I need, one chance to make this right." The next morning, Isabella woke up coughing. A small sound, at first dry, fragile. By afternoon, it became harsh, cutting through her tiny body like a blade. I took her to the clinic, clutching her in my arms. The nurse there looked at me the way people look at beggars, with both sympathy and judgment. "She needs medication," she said, scribbling quickly. "And she needs it soon, but it's not cheap." I swallowed hard. "How much?" When she said the number, I felt something inside me cave in. It wasn't much, not to the rich. But to a man who hadn't eaten that morning, it was a mountain. I tried everything. Sold my old guitar, borrowed from friends who no longer answered calls, begged the theater manager for an advance. Nothing worked. That night I sat beside Isabella as her small hands gripped mine in fevered sleep. I remember whispering, "Hold on, my angel, hold on. Papa will fix this." But the fever didn't wait. It burned through the night, each hour heavier than the last. I watched her eyes flutter, her lips murmur dreams I couldn't hear. When dawn came, I made a decision that broke something sacred in me. I went to Ricardo's house. I still don't know what gave me the courage or the desperation. Maybe both. His mansion stood on the hill, surrounded by walls higher than my hope. The guard looked at me like I didn't belong there, and he was right. "Tell him," I said, voice shaking. "Tell Ricardo Vargas that Diego Morales needs his help. Please. It's about my daughter." The guard hesitated but made the call. After a while, Ricardo himself appeared, dressed in a white linen shirt, sunglasses on, a gold watch glinting under the morning sun. He smiled when he saw me, that same calm, perfect smile that had stolen everything from me. "Diego," he said almost cheerfully, "what brings you here? Did Lucia send you?" I clenched my jaw. "No, I came for Isabella. She's sick. I need money for her medication." His smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of polite amusement. "I see, and why should I help you?" "Because she's a child," I said, my voice cracking. "Your money could save her. Please, Ricardo, I'll pay you back. I'll work for you, anything." He looked at me for a long time, silent. Then he sighed, pulled a few notes from his wallet, and tossed them toward me. "Here, that should cover it. And Diego, next time don't show up at my gate like this. It's bad for appearances." His words stung worse than a slap. But I picked up the money, because pride doesn't matter when your child is dying. I bought the medicine and took it home. By evening, Isabella's fever began to drop. She slept deeply that night, her small fingers still wrapped around mine. And as I sat there, tears burning down my face, I realized something. I would never let her see me beg again. That was the night I promised myself, No matter how long it took, no matter how many doors I had to knock on, I would rise. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't stay down. Weeks passed. Isabella recovered slowly. I took any role I could find: a beggar in a soap opera, a street vendor in a film nobody watched, even a clown at a children's party. Every little paycheck went toward rent and school. Then one day, as I left a small set in the outskirts of Mexico City, an older woman stopped me. She was short, with kind eyes and silver hair tucked into a bun. "You're Diego Morales, right?" she asked. I nodded, surprised. "I saw your performance. You have something rare," she said softly. "Pain, real pain. Most actors pretend it. You wear it." Her name was Elena Duarte, a retired actress turned acting coach. She offered to train me for free, said she saw something in me worth saving. That was the first time in a long time someone had believed in me. Every morning I went to her small studio. We practiced monologues, emotions, movement. She tore down every false layer I'd built to survive. "Acting," she said, "is not pretending, it's remembering." Under her guidance, I began to heal. Slowly. Not from losing Lucia or my mother, but from losing myself. Months later, a director visited her studio looking for new faces for a stage film called El Camino del Hombre. Elena introduced me. I auditioned with everything I had: every tear, every wound, every piece of heartbreak. When I finished, the room was silent. The director looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "We've found our lead." That night I walked home through the city lights, carrying nothing but hope. For the first time in years, it felt light enough to carry. I looked up at the sky, at the same moon my daughter must have been seeing through her small window, and whispered, "We're getting there, mi amor. We're getting there." The lights hadn't come back fully yet, but somewhere deep in the darkness I could feel them flicker, waiting to rise again. I never knew what it felt like to breathe without fear until I met Amara. Not the fleeting warmth of a stranger's smile or the temporary relief of money, but someone who saw the man behind the scars, the father behind the failure, the artist behind the struggle. It started one morning at Elena's studio. I arrived early, rubbing my eyes, exhausted from an all-night rehearsal. The studio smelled of old wood and chalk dust, familiar and comforting. Elena was already there, speaking quietly with someone I hadn't met before. "Diego, come meet Amara," she said. She was small, but her presence filled the room. Sharp eyes, like she could see through the walls of your chest, and a voice that was calm yet commanding. I remember the way she looked at me, not with pity, not with judgment, but with recognition. "I've heard about you," she said. "About your daughter, your mother, your struggles. And I've heard about your work. I think you have something worth fighting for." I wanted to explain myself, to justify the months of failure and begging and heartbreak. But she didn't wait. She handed me a script for a leading role in a new independent film. "I want you for this role," she said. "No one else, you." It was surreal. This was not a small theater, not a dusty alley stage, not a background role in a commercial. This was the real thing, an opportunity to reclaim the life I thought I'd lost. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Rehearsals, line memorization, coaching sessions. Amara was relentless but patient. She pushed me to remember every emotion I had tried to bury: the fear, the hunger, the grief, the love. "Diego," she said one evening as we practiced a particularly emotional scene, "stop acting. Live it. Your pain is your power. Every father who has failed, every man who has lost, that is your truth. Don't hide it. Use it." I cried on stage that night. Not just for the character, but for my mother, for Isabella, for the years Lucia had left me behind, for every coin tossed at my feet like it was a handout. As the filming progressed, life began to shift. The independent film gained attention in festivals. Critics praised my performance, calling it raw, heartfelt, unforgettable. Doors I thought were closed opened. I received calls from theater directors, television producers, and even agents from Mexico City's bigger studios. Isabella noticed the change. Her school uniform was no longer patched and faded. She wore shoes that fit properly and books that weren't falling apart. She smiled more, laughed more. Her little hand clutched mine differently, with pride this time, not pity. "Papa," she said one afternoon, tugging on my sleeve, "you're going to be famous, right?" "Yes, me ammer," I replied, "but not for the applause for you." And yet, amidst this rising tide, the shadows of the past were never far. Lucia's name appeared in whispers. Rumors of her life with Ricardo reached me, tales of arrests, drugs, betrayal, and misfortune. I learned that Ricardo had been caught in his own web of crime. Lucia had fallen with him, lost her money, and was now facing consequences she had never imagined. I didn't rejoice in her downfall. I only felt a quiet, almost imperceptible relief. Life had a way of balancing itself, even if it did so cruelly. Through it all, Amara remained a constant. She was more than a mentor. She became a friend, a confidant, and eventually something I could not ignore. There was an understanding between us that needed no words, the shared knowledge of pain, the recognition of survival, the subtle sparks of trust and respect that had grown from countless long nights of rehearsal. "You're different now, Diego," she said one night after a long day of shooting. "Not just because of the role, but because you've survived, and because you finally see yourself." I realized she was right. I was no longer the broken man who had begged Ricardo for coins. I was no longer the father too ashamed to pay school fees. I was an actor, a provider, a man who had fought the tide and survived. The premiere of the film was a night I will never forget. Isabella sat on my lap, wide-eyed, holding my hand as the lights dimmed and the story unfolded on the big screen. Amara sat beside me, her presence steady, unwavering. As my performance played, I felt every tear, every heartbreak, every sleepless night flash across the room. When the credits rolled, the applause was thunderous. Critics, colleagues, friends, even strangers stood and clapped. And I realized in that moment that I had made it not because of luck, not because of connections, but because I refused to stop believing in myself. Amara smiled at me quietly. "You see," she said, "you always had this inside you." I looked down at Isabella, her face glowing with pride. Then at Amara. Then at the empty chair that had once held Lucia in our small apartment, now filled with the memory of survival and hope. That night, as we walked home through the quiet streets of Mexico City, I whispered to Amara, "I don't know how to thank you for everything." She shook her head and smiled. "Don't thank me. Just promise me you'll never forget what you fought for, and never stop." I held her hand, and for the first time in years I felt safe, truly safe. Diego Morales, the struggling actor from the barrios, had survived hunger, heartbreak, and loss. But more importantly, he had learned that life's cruelest lessons often give birth to the strongest resolve. And as I held my daughter close that night, I knew that the story was far from over. The curtain had risen, and the best scenes were still to come. Life, I've learned, is never as simple as a happy ending on paper. It's messy, uneven, and often cruelly ironic. But it also has a way of balancing itself, sometimes slowly, sometimes in bursts that leave your heart pounding with disbelief. By the time the premiere of El Camino del Hombre had made waves, I was no longer the man who begged for coins or clutched the empty chair where Lucia had once sat. I had a daughter who laughed freely, a career that was finally taking shape, and Amara steady, unwavering by my side. Isabella's school fees were no longer a question. She attended one of the best schools in the city, and I watched her flourish in a world I had only dreamed of giving her. I attended parent-teacher meetings, cheered at her recitals, and marveled at the sharp mind I had helped nurture. And yet shadows of the past remained. I often thought of Lucia, the woman I had loved, the mother of my child, the one who had walked away. Rumors had reached me, as rumors always do, about Ricardo and Lucia. Ricardo had been arrested, caught in a web of illegal dealings that had swallowed him whole. Lucia, who had believed she could escape hardship by following him, was now facing the consequences of choices made for convenience rather than love. I didn't gloat. I only felt a quiet acknowledgement that life has its own way of teaching lessons, often more harshly than we can imagine. One afternoon, I received a letter from Lucia. I hesitated before opening it. My hands trembled, and for a moment the old pain threatened to resurface, but I read it anyway. She wrote about regret, about mistakes, and about seeing Isabella from a distance. She apologized for leaving, for failing to support me when we had nothing, and for believing that money could replace the bond we had. She said she had learned the hard way that true security is not bought. It is built with love, trust, and sacrifice. I read her words and felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for what was lost, relief that the storm had passed without breaking my daughter. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. I would not allow old wounds to reopen, not when the life we had built was finally taking shape. Amara became more than a mentor. She became my partner in every sense. Her belief in me was unwavering, her faith unshakable. She had walked with me through the shadows, and together we stepped into the light. The film continued to gain recognition. Invitations arrived for festivals, awards, and interviews. I traveled for work but always returned to Isabella, who was growing into a young woman with a spirit that matched her mother's and a heart that matched my own. On one evening, after a particularly successful screening, I sat with Amara on the balcony of our small apartment, overlooking the city lights. The streets below were alive, chaotic, and beautiful, much like the life I had lived. "We made it," she said softly. "We did," I replied, watching the glow of the city mirror the warmth in my chest. For the first time, I realized that success is not only measured by fame or wealth. It is measured by resilience, by the ability to rise after each fall, and by the people who believe in you when the world has turned its back. Isabella's laughter filled our home that night. She danced around the living room, her small feet tapping out a rhythm of hope and joy. I watched her and felt the weight of the past lift slightly. And then, as if to remind me of the journey we had traveled, I thought of my mother, Rosa. I had buried her in a small plot, unable to afford the hospital bills that might have saved her. But I carried her memory in every step I took, in every role I played, in every lesson I taught my daughter about perseverance and love. The curtain had risen, yes, but it was not just the curtain on a stage. It was the curtain on a life that had been rewritten, not by luck or wealth, but by endurance, belief, and the quiet strength of love. I kept acting, each role more meaningful than the last. But beyond the applause, beyond the recognition, I knew my true triumph was here at home, in the laughter of my daughter, in the unwavering support of Amara, and in the knowledge that despite losing everything, I had found a way to build it all again. Life had tested me with hunger, heartbreak, and despair. It had taken my mother, it had tested my love, and it had forced me to confront the limits of my strength. But in the end, it also gave me something far greater, the realization that we are stronger than our circumstances, and that hope, when nurtured, can rise from the ashes of our darkest days. I closed my eyes that night, holding Isabella in my arms. The city hummed softly outside our window, a lullaby for the weary and the brave. And for the first time in years, I truly felt at peace. The curtain had risen, the stage was ours, and the life we dreamed of was finally beautifully real.